Hi there, it's Maureen Wilson from Home Base in Ward 1, and I have a very, very special guest with me today. It's Mr. Ken Leendertse. Ken, I'd like you to introduce yourself. Ken works for the City of Hamilton, and we're going to talk a little bit today about the Emergency Operations Center and by law enforcement within the context of COVID. Ken?
Well, thanks, Councillor. Thanks for having me on. I've been with the city as the Director of Licensing and Bylaw Services for the last 6 years.
Yep.
But I've been in law enforcement my whole life. Actually, I was a police officer for 35 years, and the last 11 years of my career, I was the Deputy Chief of Operations and Administration, so I did both sides. It was kind of a natural to come over to the city and deal with municipal law enforcement.
Mm.
And it's definitely been a challenge coming over here.
Mm. Before Stephanie started taping, you and I were having, which was a very informative conversation for me, about the Emergency Operations Center and emergency operations centers in general within the context of municipal government. So I'd like to take this opportunity for you. I asked you, does every municipality have to have an emergency operations center? So I'm going to ask you that. And then I'd like to ask you what their mandate is and how this emergency is a little different.
Well, it's true. So the Emergency Control Group, which is what I currently sit on, I'm actually the planning chief for the Emergency Control Group. Every city or municipality has one, and it helps the municipality deal with a specific emergency. And there are really 4 components within the emergency control group. Is the operations chief that deals with the actual operations or on the ground. There's a planning chief that looks after basically what's happening currently and then where are we going in the future. There's a logistics chief that is the kind of the getters to get things for the operations. And then, of course, there's the finance aspect of it. And those 4 aspects are kind of the focus of the emergency control group. And of course, on top of that, you have the emergency control group chairman, who is right now Paul Johnson. You have a liaison person, you have a health and safety person, you have legal that's tied into that. You have risk management. So it's made up a lot of different components. But there's teams that tie into this group, and basically they are there to help the city navigate through an emergency. Now, most emergencies that I've been involved in are very short-lived. It could be as small as a tanker truck that rolls over, or a significant fire. If you remember Plastament, that
yes, I do.
Part of that. So, and it's there so that the city is not overwhelmed and that you can get all the support you need. So if you think of a very large fire, that emergency control group could be brought into. So who looks after the evacuation? So that would be a police department issue. But now what do you do with these people? So you need to put them into rec centers, and you need to feed them, you need to clothe them. You still have to deal with the actual emergency. So the control group actually can pull all the resources together and assign people to ensure that all the city needs are looked after and the citizens' needs are looked after. Now, this emergency has been completely different.
Yeah.
Because it's a very, very long, prolonged one. And health is the lead on this one. So public health is the lead, but we're here to support public health. So you've heard some of the things we've done, not only shutting down the city, trying to keep people safe, but there's the emergency shelter that's been put in place. There's the screening assessment center that's been put in place. These are all their resources that have been brought in through the city to help public health, who is actually the lead in this emergency.
So that's really interesting. So every municipality under law has to have an emergency operations center. You must practice. I think you said, did you tell me off screen, at least once a year? You have 2 types of.
There's 2 types. There's usually one of maybe a desktop, and then we try to do a full operation where you work through the issues, and it's usually compressed. So, you know, you're spending 8 hours there, but it could be over a prolonged activity of 2 or 3 days. But
Yeah.
traditionally, the emergencies only last 2 or 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
But the training is really, really important to understand the relationships of all the components in the group and how to get things done, and in particular how to record things and make sure that everything is documented, because these emergencies will be litigated for years to come, and so you want to make sure everything is documented appropriately.
Good point. And as you said, usually there's a beginning and an end to an emergency, and then the EOC is disbanded until, heaven forbid, another emergency. This one is very different because there's no means or measure to end it. It's outside of our grasp right now. So that is why the EOC is operational. It's continuing its work.
And there is quite a bit of work to be done. It not only dealing with the day-to-day operations, but the planning into the future on how do we bring services back online, and
Mm-hmm.
how do we try to bring things back to normal, and what is the new normal. And so those are decisions and discussions that have to happen, and making sure that we're doing so under the guidance of public health in this particular one, but also we have both federal and provincial governments that are very actively involved. So we have to mirror what they do as well. So it's not as Hamilton can say, all right, we're back in business.
Yeah.
We're not, we can't do that. We have to follow the provincial and federal leads. But then how do we make sure that we're meeting the needs of our citizens and trying to get things as normal as possible?
Yeah. It's not for us to say when this emergency is over.
No, it's not.
Yeah. So you were telling me also one of the priorities of the EOC is that of, can you talk to me a little bit about first responders? And then I was saying, I introduced an analogy and you said, yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. So what was
Well,
your...
there's priorities that the emergency control group follow, and one of the very first priorities is the protection of the emergency responders.
Mm,
And the reason why that's the number one priority is because if you don't look after the emergency responders, you'll have no one to deal with the emergency. And so for fire, paramedics, police, frontline health workers, you have to look after them and make sure that that they are safe, and the decisions are all bounced off of that matrix. Are our first responders safe? And then of course the next is the loss of life for the rest of the city, and then we go all the way down into the matrix where we're worried about property, or worrying about long weeds and grass, should I say, that is maybe something we overlook when we're dealing with a major emergency. And so it's how we prioritize decisions. And some people will say, well, I want this cleaned up, but I'm sorry, that's not really a priority. And so I think the best way to say is during an emergency, it's not business as usual.
mm,
Things have changed. The priorities have changed, and so there's a matrix that the emergency control group follows to make sure that we can get out of this emergency with the least loss of life and property damage as possible.
mm. And I was using the analogy of when you're in a plane and the oxygen mask drops down, you secure it to the adult first, and to ensure that the adult has the means to assist the child. So we have to take care of our first responders so they can take care of us, right?
That's right.
So you've mentioned some of the provincial and federal regulations and responses. Can you talk to me a little bit about what is the role of the city in enforcing those provincial directives, and what's the relationship between the provincial directives and the municipal directives?
Well, this is an interesting time because for the first time, the provincial government recognizes that the police were probably going to be overwhelmed in the enforcement of the Emergency Measures and Civil Protections Act, which is the legislation that creates the emergency for the province. And so probably the first time that I know of in the last 40 years that the province actually gave the authority and the power to municipal law enforcement officers, bylaw officers, to enforce provincial legislation. Traditionally, we're not allowed to enforce provincial legislation like speeding or a trespass act. But this piece of legislation, the provincial government decided that it's important that we get the message out, that we give this legislation to keep essential businesses operating and non-essential businesses closed, but also to enforce about physical distancing, numbers of groups, that kind of activity, because the province also decided that we have to close down all these different amenities that are involved with the city, from tennis courts to basketball courts to ball diamonds. All these things, they specifically closed down so that there was not groups of people gathering, because the public officer of health has said that keep people apart, keep people at home, and they'll stay safe and we'll get out of this pandemic quickly. And so that's what the provincial legislation was designed for. Now, as you know, council also approved a physical distancing bylaw.
Mm-hmm.
And this was fairly new legislation, although Toronto did it, and I know Brampton and Burlington have done that. It really gives municipal law enforcement and police the authority to prevent people from being too close to each other. People that are not under the same, don't live in the same house, or don't live in the same relationship. So the idea is that people aren't gathering. This isn't party time. This isn't a time to have a party or meet with your neighbors. We want people to keep the distance so that they're not transmitting the virus from one group to another, because once you do that, it's going to prolong that activity. So the bylaw itself was designed to give municipal law enforcement and police officers the ability to talk to people, to educate people, say, you can't do that. And then, of course, the work that we're doing through the provincial legislation.
Yeah, I would be just part of less than forthcoming if in all of this. That's the one that I really struggled with, that from a perspective of civil liberties. But I kept coming back to the role of discretion on behalf of your enforcement team, and how would I feel if my partner was a first line worker and we didn't do all that was within our grasp to do to ensure that we were supporting them and their efforts, that we were creating an environment that underscored the messages from our Chief Medical Officer of Health. And I asked that question at virtual council: is this measure being recommended by our Chief Medical Officer of Health? And the answer I got was yes. So that really had a lot of it really answered a lot of my concerns, thinking about my friends and neighbors and all the other residents, that in this particular emergency, we need to send the message that physical distancing is working, and it needs to work because lives depend on it.
Well, Councillor, you're so right. I think it's that gentle balance, but we are in a state of emergency, and I think that's where things change. And the role of enforcement changes too. And I know I've talked many times about our philosophy in municipal law enforcement, and it's all about compliance. We try to get people to comply, we try to educate, we try to create that awareness. And we only use enforcement as one of the last tools. Now, sometimes there is a general deterrence, and I'll go back to the dealing with Albion Falls that we spent when we first went to Albion Falls. We spent 3 months educating awareness, and still 400, 500, 1,000 people coming down on a weekend. Mm-hmm. And thank you very much, but yeah, I'll do whatever I want. And so from that point on, we eventually had to move into enforcement. Yeah. And we always use enforcement if someone doesn't want to abide by your direction and all that. It's a tool, but sometimes you have to give a general deterrence. And what happens? The word gets out and says, "Oh, we're going to get a ticket if we're down in Albion Falls. Don't go there." Mm-hmm. And we have seen a reduction. Even even during this emergency, we were seeing 100 people a day down in Albion Falls, 100, 150 people a day. When we first started, probably 300 people, and even in the cold weather. And since the emergency and we're back down there educating people, we are seeing as little as 10, 15 people a day. And unfortunately, it's not Hamiltonians. Hamiltonians are staying home and doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's people from Toronto and from Windsor and London and Kitchener all wanting to see our beautiful falls, and they just don't want to pay attention. So that's why we have people down there full time. But you and I have talked about the role of discretion, and it's something that we use very carefully. That discretion doesn't mean, yeah, you can get away with anything, and you should just give me a pass or educate me. Sometimes you have to do enforcement to get the message out, and so it's a gentle balance that we use. But certainly, our philosophy has always been about compliance. And I got to tell you, our teams are out there every day, and they're seeing a noticeable difference. We laughed last week. There was a tweet that came from someone in Burlington and said, the walkways in Burlington, there's people all over, they're walking, they're crowded, and then you go anywhere on the waterfront trail in Hamilton and there's no one there. And so we're quite proud of that, because we closed the trail because there was thousands of people down there every day, not social distancing. And so a little bit of enforcement, a little bit of education, and it goes a long way. And I think that's why Hamilton's doing so well in our numbers.
Yeah, well, I know I have a role in that education because, I mean, this is an unprecedented situation, and it's important for me as to make sure I'm doing all that I can to be clear on what those directives are, so we can help people understand what they are, where they apply, but why they're so important at this time. And I know it's not easy. It's not easy for anyone. But as I always go back to saying, our lives and the lives of those we love depend on it. So we're all in this.
They say we're all in this together, and
All in the
you know
boat
what?
together.
Hopefully, if we all participate, then we can maybe see our summer, which that'd be wonderful.
Before you go, because I know you have been working extraordinary hours, and thank you so much. We are going to get questions, particularly as the weather gets a little warmer and the snow has now melted. You did allude to it, but we have some priorities which we have to focus on. We have ongoing property standard issues. Can you speak to how your shop is dealing with those and how you're managing those?
So I think it's actually very timely. So prioritized, we have prioritized all the COVID-19 investigations. So anything that was closed, we have to enforce. Essential businesses, we have our licensing team doing that. We have our animal services team looking after dog parks and making sure people aren't using that according to the provincial order. But we still have to respond to the dog bite calls and the dog at large calls. And so I have 3 teams that actually work for me: licensing and licensing, which looks after businesses; municipal law enforcement looks after all the municipal bylaws; and animal services that looks after, of course, the pound and any animal services issues. So we prioritize the amount of calls that we're doing because we only have so many staff. And but as we start to see improvements, we're starting to be able to shift resources. And so I had a meeting today with our GM, and we talked about what can we do in particular on some of these proper standards issues. Now, if it was a life-threatening issue or a safety issue, of course, that becomes a priority. But traditionally, a lot of the garbage and debris and all that would not be a priority for us right now. But what we're hoping to do is put together a small task force of a small team that can look after a lot of these priority calls that are out there right now. So we're hoping within the next week or so that we can start getting to some of these outstanding complaints. It's not going to be business as usual. We won't have our our summer students that we normally have that have done such a great job in the Westdale neighborhood, Mohawk, McMaster area. But we're going to try to do the very best we can with the limited resources we had. Again, our priority will be COVID, be trying to keep people safe. But as this emergency starts to wind down, we'll be bringing on more and more online of our regular work. And so I think it'll take us a while to get back to normal. We might not see a new normal till next year, but we are hearing the councillors loud and clear that there are lots of concerns out there about property standards and garbage and debris, and we are working towards to put a small team together to be able to resolve those.
Thank you so much for your time today, Ken. Again, it is, I think, part of my responsibility to inform and educate and try and disseminate information, and you've been very instrumental in helping me do that, and I do appreciate all that you're doing.
Thank you very much, and be safe.